Welcome to the keynote presentation at the Animal Law Conference. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Pamela Hart, and I'm the Executive Director and Assistant Dean here at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. Thank you for joining us today, Carl. Now we will begin with Carl's presentation. Carl Safina's lyrical nonfiction writing explores how humans are changing the living world and what the changes mean for non-human beings and for all of us. His work fuses scientific understanding, emotional connection, and a moral call to action. His writing has won a MacArthur Genius Prize, Pew, Guggenheim, and National Science Foundation fellowships, book awards from Lannan, Oren, and the National Academy, and the John Burroughs, James Beard, and George Robb medals. He grew up raising pigeons, training hawks and owls, and spending as many days and nights in the woods and on the water as he could. Safina is now the first endowed professor of nature and humanity at Stony Brook University and is the founding president of the not-for-profit Safina Center. He hosted the PBS series Saving the Ocean, and his writings appear in the New York Times, Time, The Guardian, Audubon, Yale, E360, and National Geographic, and on the web at the Huffington Post, CNN, Medium, and elsewhere. Safina is the author of 10 books, including the classic Song for the Blue Ocean, as well as New York Times bestseller Beyond Words, What Animals Think and Feel. His most recent book is Becoming Wild: How Animal Cultures Raise Families, Create Beauty, and Achieve Peace. He lives on Long Island, New York with his wife Patricia and their dogs and feathered friends. And with that, we'll turn it over to Carl. Thank you.
I'm going to talk to you today about the subject of my two most recent books. One is about what animals think and feel. Animal cognition and emotion is a fancier way of saying it. And the other is about culture in non-human animals. So we're going to start with a question that many of you have asked yourselves, and that is, does my dog really love me, or does she just want a treat? How could we tell? Well, maybe we could tell by simply looking at them. Isn't it obvious that they love us, and isn't it easy to see what's going on in those furry little heads? Well, maybe it's actually not very easy to know what's going on in those furry little heads, but I would say that something is definitely going on. You can't tell me that there is absolutely no mental functioning going on. Obviously, there is. But why is our question about them, do they love us? That is not a question about them. That's a question about us. That's a question about my insecurity, if I want to know if my dog loves me. So I needed a different question to try to get into those furry little heads. And my question became, who are you? Who are you is a question about you. It's no longer a question about me, and it can give us a way in. We all know that the human mind has a variety of capacities. The question is, are these capacities only the province of human minds? What is going on in the other brains that share this planet with us? For a long time, many scientists said, well, that's not even a scientific question because there's no way in. But I would say that that is wrong. There are some very good ways in. You can look at the brain. You can consider the organizing principle of all of biology, evolution, and you can simply watch what they do. Now, a nerve cell is basically the same thing, whether it is in a human or a dog or a frog or a jellyfish, where they first appeared. They're basically still the same everywhere. And if we look at evolution, we see that evolution doesn't just invent new things all the time. It takes what is in stock on the shelf and it fabricates a new twist, and it makes progress that way. So you see on the left there's a rather simple, basic mammalian brain, and then there's a much more complicated looking mammalian brain. If you look at a human and a chimpanzee brain, you see we basically have more or less the same brain. It's just that ours is quite a bit bigger, which is good for us because we are the most insecure of all of the apes. But that's a dolphin, which has a bigger and more complicated brain. Is this the answer? Does this tell us everything we need to know about who is more intelligent? No. We can see brains, but we cannot see the mind. However, you can see the mind's workings in the logic of behaviors. And you can see that many other animals use logic that we relate to very easily. For instance, these elephants have made a decision that makes perfect sense to them and to us. The decision is they have found a patch of shade to let their babies go to sleep. It's very hot over there, and it's very sunny in most of that area, but they have found a patch of shade. They let the babies go to sleep, but the bigger elephants do not sleep. They doze. They doze facing outward and touching one another because the world is a dangerous place. We understand their logic because it's our logic. It's the same kind of decision. And that's because on the same plains, under the arc of the same hot sun, listening to the roars and the whoops of the same potential dangers, we became who we are, and they became who they are. We've been neighbors for a very long time. The imperatives among all of us are basically the same, and the broad outlines of life are basically the same, just like the broad outlines of our bodies are, but with differences. So all of us have to try to stay alive, try to find enough to eat, try to keep our babies alive. That's basically the arc of a lifetime. We look the way that we do, elephants look the way that they do, whales look the way that they do, but under the skin, we are very, very similar. We have basically all of the same bones. In a whale's front flippers, they have the same 5 fingers with the same exact bones we have in our hands. All of their organs are the same as ours. The neurotransmitters and the brain chemicals that create mood and motivation for us, they have. Under the skin, we are all kin. And so we see things that are very familiar. We see the young exploring the world. Everything is interesting as they discover what it's like to be here on planet Earth. We see the deep bonds of family affection, and we see the ecstasy of courtship. We know and understand play and having a good time and fooling around, and so do many other species, many other creatures. And how do we know if they ever have a thought? And how do we know if they ever feel? Well, there are some very easy ways of telling and addressing that question. For instance, if my pup comes over to me and rolls over on her back, and this is something that she does not do to, let's say, the dining room table or a sofa. She doesn't go to the dining room table and roll over on her back. She comes to me and rolls over on her back. And that's because she's just had a thought. And that thought is, I would like my belly rubbed. And I'm going to go over to Carl because he and I are family. And I trust him 150%. And I know that if I roll over on my back, he will understand what I'm saying to him and what I'm asking for. I want this to happen because it feels good. I know it feels good from past experience. I anticipating it feeling good. And I know that Carl knows how to do this job and get the job done well and make it feel good. So she has had a thought and she has had a pleasant feeling. And in a way, it's not any more complicated than that. If you think that's not scientific enough and you like technology, well, there are people who put dogs in MRIs. They watch their brains light up. They show them photos of strangers and photos of people that they know, and they see the difference in how they light up when they recognize people they know. If you've ever seen your dog sleeping with her paws twitching and going woof, 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 you might say, oh, I think she might be dreaming. I wonder, do dogs dream? Well, yes, actually dogs do dream. In fact, not only dogs dream, but rats dream. Those are all cross sections of that sleeping rat's brain as it's dreaming. It's no surprise to me that mammals dream, but recently I read a new study that did surprise me, and that study said that cuttlefish even dream. I thought that was pretty interesting. Now, let's talk a little bit about culture. When we consider culture, we almost never ask, what is culture and why does culture exist? But all humans have culture. Culture is a major aspect of being human. And human societies differ in their culture. We are all different in our culture. Why don't we have the same culture? When we say, well, what is culture? Well, culture is art and religion and music. That is not what culture is. Those are products of culture. So let's talk about what culture is and why it exists. And then we'll understand a little bit better how to ask that question about other species. As I mentioned, all humans are cultural, but right through each culture, you can easily see basic humanity and human dignity. What varies is the culture itself, not the people behind it. So culture is the learned behaviors and preferences, skills, habits, even aesthetics that flow socially. It's not instinctive, it's something we learn and we get it socially and we pass it along socially. That's what culture is. So why does culture exist? It does some very important things. It tells us who we are. It gives us an identity. And most importantly, it answers the questions about how do we live here where we happen to live. And that's one of the reasons that cultures vary, and even cultures within cultures vary, because the answers to the questions of how do we live here are different, and many of them are quite arbitrary, but they differ. And knowing the answers and knowing those who have the same answers helps us get along, helps us form groups, and gives the groups group identity and identity as individuals within groups. Where do we get it from? Mostly we get it from our mothers. That's where we get it from first. And then maybe our fathers, elders, peer groups. Now, just consider any baby who is born in the Amazon or who is born in the Arctic can learn to be a completely competent adult in either place, in either culture. We have the flexibility as little children to learn any culture. But once we learn that culture, we are kind of stuck with that culture. We don't know other cultures and our flexibility goes away. So if you're raised in the Amazon, you may know dozens of different kinds of food plants or medicinal plants. You may be very skilled at hunting monkeys with a blowpipe. But if you were suddenly dropped in the Arctic, you would die, even though there are people living in the Arctic who know how to live in the Arctic. They don't know anything about where to find fruit, but they know how to hunt seals through holes in the ice. They know how to withstand a night that lasts 4 months. They know how to live there. If you took somebody from the Arctic and put them in the lush Amazon, they would die. That is the importance of culture. Culture answers the questions about how do we live here? And that is often a matter of life and death. We are not the only cultural beings. There are many creatures who rely very heavily on what they learn culturally. And we'll start out with chimpanzees, since they're a lot like us in many ways. What does a young chimpanzee have to learn? Well, imagine a chimpanzee born in captivity and raised immediately from infancy in a human home, and then taken to the best chimpanzee habitat in Africa and released at age 10, let's say. They would die. They don't know anything about how to be a chimpanzee. They have no idea where the food is, how to get it. They have no idea how to interact socially, even though almost everything about chimpanzee life is social. That's something that they share with us. They wouldn't know how to defer to individuals of higher rank. They wouldn't know how to recognize higher rank. They really wouldn't know how to do anything at all. This is true not only of humans and apes, it's true of quite a few other animals. Sperm whales, for instance, are very cultural. They are also very odd looking from our point of view, but they're also very mammalian when you look at their behavior. If you spend some time with sperm whales, you see them doing a lot of things a lot of other mammals do. They greet very energetically. They love to rub and touch each other. They live in groups that are organized a lot like elephant families with a leading female. And at adolescence, the males leave. They have a different kind of a life and a different kind of culture. The sperm whales do some really amazing things with their culture. They can announce themselves through a series of patterned clicks that are a little bit like Morse code. They announce themselves as individuals. Hello, it's me. They announce what family they belong to, and they announce what clan their family is a member of. And with sperm whales, if you hear another whale that is a member of your clan, you can go over and socialize with them. If they are not a member of your clan, you avoid them. Why would whales do something like that? Why would culture make individuals form groups and then avoid other groups? Because they have different answers to the questions of how do we live here. They travel at different rates, in different patterns, different distances from the coast. You need to be with those who understand how to do things the way you understand how to do things, or else everybody will get confused. And that's one of the reasons we have culture, and that's one of the reasons it works that way. When we see other animals, we almost never think about this, and we almost never think of them as individuals. So we would say, okay, here are 3 chimpanzees. But that's not how they see each other. They know each other as individuals, and they have histories and interactive dynamics with one another. So Hawa there is the most dominant member of his social group, his community. Musa was a contender for dominance in the same contest that Hawa won. Musa lost. Although the researchers had their money on Musa, he seemed like he was the most natural to become the most dominant individual. But because he lost, and because he was interested in being the most dominant individual, he and Hawa keep a very close eye on one another. They can't really afford to be very far from each other, although they don't really like each other that much. They are what we would call in humans frenemies. Simon in the back there is an up and coming male. He's too young to try to become the alpha of the community, but he may in a few years challenge Hawa. So they both keep a close eye on each other as well. Chimpanzees are not only very cultural, they're very political. They plan and they scheme and they think a few steps ahead. So here are a few more chimpanzees. And if you just glance at them, you say, okay, well, these are all chimpanzees. But if you look at them for a few seconds, you see that they look individually about as different as humans do. And of course, they know each other very well as individuals. They understand who's been where and what's happened in their lives and in their interactions together. Lottie is a very senior female and a mother of 2. Talisker used to be a dominant male. He has managed to find a place for himself beside the hierarchy, outside the hierarchy. He's managed to maintain a lot of status without contesting for dominance. Ben is the current most dominant or alpha male in his community. Masariki there is a young male, an adolescent male. All chimpanzees are born with pale faces, and they almost all blacken as they get older. But Masariki is going to be one of the ones, sort of a minority of chimpanzees, who likely will always have a pale face. And chimpanzees have figured out an answer to a problem that humans seem incapable so far to solve. And that problem and that answer is that what color your face is really makes no difference at all. When people talk about biodiversity, which is simply the diversity of living things on Earth, it's often described as happening on three levels: the genetic diversity within a species, the diversity among species, and the diversity of habitats, vast arrays of living things that differ from place to place. All of these ways of talking about it all are about the genetics, but that doesn't cover it, because culture is the overlooked fourth dimension of biodiversity. If all of the animals of a species die out in a region, the way to live there dies out with them. The knowledge of how to live there dies out with them. And you can't just get it back by dumping a bunch of animals into that area and calling it a reintroduction. Because to the extent that they have culture, the lack of culture, the answer of how do we live here, is going to be a big problem for them. This is a thick-billed parrot. They used to live in the Southwest United States. All of the thick-bills in the Southwest disappeared. Conservationists raised a bunch of them in captivity, thinking they would reintroduce them to the Southwest, and they did. They brought them there and they opened the doors. The parrots flew away and they all died because they didn't know how to live there. They didn't know where the food was, what was food there, where do you go at night, what do you do when the weather gets cold, what's dangerous here. They didn't know that and they died. And this has hampered reintroduction attempts in many places. For instance, there are places where all the bighorn sheep have been shot out and people just went and put more sheep in. At the easiest time of year, when they're all in the high meadows and there's plenty of food and everything is nice and benign, and winter comes and they don't know what to do because they really don't know where they are. If there were a few left that carried the memory of the culture, they would simply go down to their winter range and all the new ones would follow the ones who knew what to do. But if there are none left there, then reintroducing is going to be difficult, much more expensive, involve a lot more suffering, and may not work. That's part of the importance of culture, thinking about culture and conservation and maintaining it. Here are some orca whales or killer whales. It turns out that the one with the tall fin there was 36 years old when I took that picture. The one to his left is his cousin. She was 42. They've known each other for decades. They are not just some killer whales. They are a very specific family. And killer whales or orcas are among the most cultural of all animals. And one of the things they do that's very cultural is some of them eat only fish and some of them eat only mammals. The mammal eaters do not eat fish and the fish eaters do not eat mammals at all. They basically will not. And they basically don't know how. If you're going to be fishing, you want to be in a big, noisy group that can scare the fish together. If you're going to be hunting seals, you want to be in a very small group and you want to move silently. If they mingled, they would screw each other up because the answer to how they live here is very different because of the different cultures, the different hunting cultures that they have, that they learn from their parents. It turns out that with orca whales on the West Coast, these two types of whales, the fish and the mammal hunters, have not interbred for about 300,000 years. Even though they overlap, they live in the same area, but they avoid each other. And basically, they are starting to evolve differences, and the differences are detectable physically and genetically. So they're beginning to evolve into different species, really, based on a cultural difference. And that's something that I call cultural selection. When your culture can make you specialize, and that specialization will help you to be with some and avoid others of your own species, that is what I call cultural selection, and it has evolutionary consequences. Now let's look at orca whales a little more closely for a moment. There are a variety of groups, as I mentioned, who eat seals. Why won't they eat people? Isn't that weird and interesting? And why can we trust them around our toddlers? And why don't they hold a grudge for all that we've done to them and their kind? The things that make us human are not the things that we tell ourselves are the things that make us human. Almost everything we see in ourselves, we can see something of, some glimmer of, in at least some other species. And love and affection and bonds and knowing who we are is not the thing that makes us human. There's a lot of that in the rest of the living world. Some of my favorite birds are seabirds, and some of my favorite birds are albatrosses. Albatrosses are very, very devoted mates and very devoted parents. Usually, it takes them about a year to raise a chick. Some species, maybe 6 months. That's still very long for a bird. These are Laysan albatrosses, and albatrosses nest on some of the most remote places in the world. These are on Laysan Island. They're as far from a continent as you can get on Earth, right in the middle of the ocean on a very small island about 3 miles across. Many of us have never heard of Laysan Island. Almost no one thinks of it every day, if you ever think of it at all. But they know all about us because this is their home and this is what we have done to their home without thinking about it. We've named ourselves after our minds that we're so proud of. Homo sapiens, we're supposed to be the wise ones. We are the clever ones who really don't like to think very much about the consequences of what we're doing. So these albatrosses go for about 2 or 3 weeks, about 6,000 or 8,000 miles of flying to bring back one big meal for a chick who is waiting in a nest there. And what do they feed them? Well, they feed them fish and squid and plastic. Almost all of the meals now contain plastic. It smells to them like food. All the chicks have plastic in them these days. And although it doesn't always kill them, it's never good for them, and sometimes it does kill them. This one was about 6 months old, almost ready to fly, and it died, and it was packed with red cigarette lighters. Now, this is not supposed to be our relationship with the rest of the living world, but it is the relationship that we have because we don't think about the consequences of what we're doing. And yet, when we expect new human life, we paint animals on the nursery room walls. We don't paint cell phones or work cubicles. We paint animals. Most of us don't even know why we do this. We just think it's cute. We don't really know why it's animals we're choosing. And I've thought about this a lot, and I have an idea, and I'll share my idea with you. I think it's an unconscious blessing for our unborn child. And I think that blessing is, welcome to this beautiful world. We're not alone here. We have company. And yet, every one of those animals in any painting you will ever see of Noah's Ark, the animals that are deemed worthy of salvation by the Creator, every one of them is in deep trouble now. And the flood that is coming at them is us. I mentioned evolution earlier. This is the evolution story we are creating about the history of life on Earth. It's not a great one to have on our resume. This is a story we've told ourselves for a long time, that we're the only ones that matter and we're at the pinnacle of everything. Everything is here for us. But this is a realer view. Everything that's here has made the whole journey here along with us. We are one of the more recent ones to come along, not the most recent one to come along, and we're all here together. That's the real story. If we try to wrap our heads a little bit around the whole history of life on Earth, in all of its diversity and all of its deep time, it boggles the human mind. It is essentially impossible for us to really understand who we are, how we got here, and to see ourselves in perspective. Now, this is one of my favorite birds, the Peregrine Falcon. When I was in high school in 1970, they were believed doomed to extinction because of pesticides. People did not think anything could be done. But then 2 years later, the worst pesticides that were wiping out these birds and others like bald eagles were actually banned. And the environment started to clean itself up over time. So people did not take the extinction of the peregrine falcon lying down. A few people wanted to do something about it. They bred them in captivity for reintroduction. I was one of the people who did not take it lying down. And yes, that is me. That is me in 1975. And I'm happy to say it worked. Bald eagles were almost completely extinct south of Canada. It worked for them too. Ospreys were completely gone from my region when I was a teenager. Now there are 6 nests within a mile of my house. It worked for them. Humpback whales were hunted almost to extinction. Now there are so many after a few decades of protection that you can take selfies with them. When people refuse to accept extinction and the destruction of the world, we can get the job done, and the rest of life knows what to do. So I started with a question about whether they love us, and I want to invert the question and ask whether the human mind has the intellect and the emotional capacity to simply let the rest of life continue to exist on Earth. Thank you very much, everybody. It's really an honor to be with you.
Thank you, Carl. That was wonderful. And now we're going to be starting our Q&A session with Carl. And we have a number of questions coming in, so why don't we just get right with it? The first one is, what do you see as the greatest challenge to humans recognizing animals as individuals, and what's the best avenue to overcoming it?
Well, I think the greatest challenge is that we don't really have much personal experience with other animals. Many people have a dog or a cat or both. And those that do will say, well, it's very obvious. My dog or my cat is thinking about things, and they have such different personalities. That's obvious because it's basically the only animal we have any real experience with. Almost nobody, gets the privilege of or the luxury of being able to just watch animals in their normal habitats, in their normal lives, day after day for years. Only the very few professional behavioral ecologists get to do that. I've been able to do that. And when you do that, you start to see that other animals are individuals. Otherwise, you just see pictures, or you might get a glimpse. You know, even people who go and look for wild animals on vacations, they have a guided tour somewhere, and they say, look, those are elephants. Okay, we saw elephants. Look, those are elk. Okay, we saw elk. Those are bison. But they don't get to see the family lives, don't get to understand the history of individuals. We just don't have any experience with most other animals. And that's the biggest impediment to seeing them as individuals.
Mm-hmm. So the next question here is, can culture exist across species? In other words, can humans and other species meaningfully share and understand a common culture?
That is possible in certain circumstances. Again, you know, within our families, our dogs and cats, I would say especially dogs, because dogs are really social group oriented animals. And they understand the culture of different families. They know what we do when we do it. They anticipate things. They know what the cues are in your household, and those differ among different households. So those are different family cultures that other animals are part of in that case. In the wild, there are some groups of animals that live in mixed species groups. They may, for instance, understand an alarm call that is given by one species. I was on a trip in Trinidad one time, and it was we had hired a bird guide, and suddenly he said, "Oh, I hear those birds. Do you hear all of that alarm calling? They have found a snake." So they were all calling the snake alarm call, which they all understood. And then we went there, which was about a quarter-mile away. And there was a boa in a tree surrounded by birds of different species. And they had all basically said, you know, whoever found that snake had said, "Hey, there's a snake here, everybody." So, you know, without the element of surprise, that snake's cover was blown, and those birds were making sure that that snake would not succeed in killing anybody as long as they had their eye on it. So I would say, you know, things like that is what I might point to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a lot of questions here, so I'll just keep going. How could the concept of animal culture be introduced into public policy and into legal arguments?
In public policy, I think we have to understand that we cannot let populations go extinct thinking we can just reintroduce them, because we can't just reintroduce all the learning about how to live here, which is what culture is. That has to be learned and reinvented. And as I mentioned, reinventing it takes usually a few generations with a lot of mortality before a few lucky individuals figure out where to go and what to do. So that's the first thing. You cannot let populations go extinct. And I would say, you know, that concept needs to be enshrined in the legal protections as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And to build on that a little bit, as we talk about extinction, you know, in your presentation, it's been wonderful to see how some species have been saved from extinction. How and if does this impact other species?
I'm sorry, how does it impact other species to save some from extinction?
Mm-hmm. Is there any ripple
Well,
effect?
I mean, everything, you know, this is one of the things in our thinking. We think that all the species in an area are a collection of different objects. They are a meshwork of relationships. You can't just unweave the tapestry and expect that, you know, if you pull out all the gold threads, you're going to have the same picture. And then you pull out all the purple threads, then you pull out all the green threads. It falls apart. our thinking about this is wrong. Life is about relationships. It's not a collection of things. And creatures and plants rely on other creatures and plants. You may have heard about the tremendous decline in insect numbers that is showing up in many parts of the world and is actually quite noticeable in many places now. For instance, we're just looking up at the lights in midsummer at night. There used to be clouds of moths where I live with bats swooping through them. Well, you can look at a street light at night now and see no insects, or 2 or 3, and no bats. And what do insects do, among other things? They pollinate. I just read an article today that was talking about the danger to plants from the loss of insect pollinators that is going on. This has to be pointed out to people because we do not understand that living things diversify based on relationships. That's why there's not just, I don't know what, one bacterium in the world. The diversification is built upon relationships.
Thank you. Switching gears a little bit, we have a question here that asks, what role does better human family planning and investing more in kids play in solving the problems you see?
Well, the most basic problem is there are just far too many people for the rest of life on Earth. And humans are too much of a good thing. There are a lot of very remarkable things about our species. We are by far the most creative, by far the most empathic, by far the cruelest, and by far the most destructive. We are all of those things rolled together, but we take up a lot of space, and we use water and wood and things like that, and we mine for what we need, and all of this takes the ability to live away from other species. So the pattern of human population growth around the world roughly reflects patterns of human dignity and well-being. This is a very lucky thing. This is maybe the luckiest thing on Earth, is that what is really good for people is really good for the rest of life on Earth, especially where women have full citizenship, where women can own things, inherit things, get bank loans, own businesses, buy and sell property, all the things that involve any level of citizenship. When women have achieved all of that, the rate of population increase basically flattens out. And as I say, I think that's the luckiest thing on Earth, because it solves maybe the 2 biggest problems and the 2 biggest injustices in the world. And this is a new thing everywhere in the world. In the West, in Europe and in the United States, women really did not have full access to education in my mother's time. It was expected that women would not have higher education and not have careers, and they were, very, very much discouraged or prevented from achieving those things. And this has largely broken down in the Western world. And if you look at patterns of population, I don't know if you just heard my dogs just start barking. If you look at patterns of population, they have basically plateaued, slowed, maybe started a slow decline everywhere except on the continent of Africa, which is expecting explosive growth. About another 1 billion or 2 people are expected in Africa, not on the other continents, as far as it looks right now.
And then, so to build on that, there's another question that's somewhat related. Could you elaborate on why culture could be learned more from mother than from a father?
Most parental care in species with parental care comes from Well, I would say most of it comes from the mother in mammals. Most mammals do not have any male parental care or have very little male parental care. So that's why, and also, the relationship, especially in mammals, with the mother is usually extremely tight for years. Often they're never out of reach of one another. That's really the only reason. I think in birds, it usually takes a male and a female to raise a brood. So that doesn't really apply so much to birds. And in other cultural species, there are cultural species of fish, for instance. It varies. Some of them have two parents. Some of them, the male takes care of them. But in mammals, most mammals have no parental care or light care from the father. Humans, at our best, are an exception. Wolves are an exception. But chimpanzees, for instance, there's zero male care of young. And oddly enough, males sometimes adopt orphaned infants in chimpanzees. So they're aware of the need for a young one to have care. And it's a facultative thing in chimpanzees, which I find really very interesting. Mm-hmm. But there's not a pair bond. There is not a nuclear family in chimpanzees. There is in wolves, which is why we do not have chimpanzees living with us in our homes. They don't understand nuclear families. They only understand the quest for dominance. But wolves understand nuclear families, and that's what we have in our homes. Dogs' only ancestors are wolves. Dogs are domesticated wolves, and they work well with us because they implicitly understand a nuclear family.
Great answer. Thank you. Moving on to the next one. What is the accurate argument against people who claim humans must manage other species? Development is encroaching on habitat. So this is what Fish and Game uses to justify managing other beings.
Okay, well, I only got part of that because my dogs have now decided to make a huge racket. Even though we're in a really quiet neighborhood right now, they're really trying very hard to get everyone's attention here.
Yes, they know they're among friends.
I heard the first part, and okay, we'll see if you need to reiterate. But the argument against the idea that humans need to manage other species is that is wrong. There were a lot of species doing exceptionally well until we came along. In fact, what we need to do is manage our own behavior, which we're very bad at. We are really bad for essentially every other species on Earth. Every other species and every habitat is at its lowest level and its most degraded in the history of the last, what would I say, since the event that killed the dinosaurs. And that's on us. We're the people who did that. So it's not true that other species need to be managed. I hear this argument worst when it regards hunting, that animals need to be hunted. I don't know why people think that when they evolved millions of years before there were any humans, and they did fantastically well for themselves in an incredibly abundant world. Nowadays, though, there are some management needs, and from people who have the idea that they're trying to do the best for things in very manipulated and very artificialized habitats. I think that there is need for management, especially protection, especially in cases where populations are very, very fragmented. It may be necessary to actually move individuals around to keep the genetic diversity viable. Otherwise, these little fragmented populations can blink out. Connecting those populations by building and restoring corridors is important. People in some places now are inventing and installing bypasses where creatures can get across interstate highway systems and things like that, or amphibians can get to ponds where they have to cross roads. There are a variety of things that can be done that I would say fall under the idea of wildlife management. But it's not the idea that we need to manipulate things because otherwise everything simply can't do without us. We need to fix some of the problems we cause, and there I think yes, there's a case to be made.
Thank you. Another question here: how can we allow more experience with animals in their natural habitat without disturbing the habitat?
Well, interestingly, if you have benign people and not a mix of benign people and killers, that can work very well. Like I was in the Amazon when I was working on my last book, and we were seeing loads of monkeys and loads of birds. And it was remarked to me that where the animals are hunted, they hide very well and it's very hard to see anything. Where they have no experience with humans, they tend to be shy and hide, trying to figure out what these people are up to. They probably have a little experience with humans, with indigenous people hunting them at very, very low population levels. But basically they're not that familiar with people. But if you go to a place where there are a lot of tourists, animals get very habituated and they pretty much go about doing what they would normally do. So that's why you can go to national parks and watch animals that would normally never show themselves, like the wolves in Yellowstone. You try to see a wild wolf anywhere, and I can basically guarantee that you will never see one. And if I bet everybody, I'd probably lose 2 bets and win 1,000 bets. But everybody can go to Yellowstone and watch the wolves there because they're accustomed to people. And that goes for all the other animals there.
Great. How about one more question here? I think this is a good one to wrap it up today. If the average person was to ask you what the one most important, doable, and relatively easy thing they can do to allow our environment to start healing and the world's creatures live as they should without human interference, what would you tell them?
Well, you said one thing. So I would say a small family, and then I would cheat, and I would say the other thing is share the culture of love and compassion for life on Earth. Those would be my 2 things.
Thank you, Carl. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today, too. It's been just a really interesting and engaging conversation, so I appreciate that. And thank you all who are out there for joining us and watching today. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for having me.